Hello. Hello. Hello, my fantastic friends, and welcome to another gaming adventure with the Sleepy Time Dragon. My apologies for not having uploaded a video in a little while. Life has been especially hectic lately, but I am back, and I thought in honor of my favorite spookiest season that I would play a little Darkest Dungeon and read to you some dark fantasy, pirates, and ghosts short stories from this lovely hardcover book I picked up at the bookstore. It is part of the Dark Fantasy Collection from Flame Tree Publishing. And it says, hauntings at sea, shipwrecks, and buried treasure, deadly monsters lurking beneath the waves. All this and more in the treacherous waters of this anthology of original and classic short stories and novel extracts, featuring dark tales by such greats as Joseph Conrad, F. Marion Crawford, and William Hope Hodgson, mixed with works by incredible new writers. The wild force of the sea has never seemed so deadly. And I figure first we'll start off with a thrilling tale called Curse of the Paisley Witch by John A. Carr. With the exception of one peculiar swath, the waves of the blood moon's peak tide crashed on the beach with heightened fervor. Mist swirled on the surface of this unnaturally becalmed area, and tendrils writhed towards the orb as the shadow that once drove humans insane with fear began to claim it. Yet the waning moonlight glowed brighter here, perhaps due to the reflection upon the mists. Just beneath the surface, a vague form floated, perfectly still, as if taking stock of scant beach walkers, too distracted by alcohol and the eclipse to notice. In unison with the crashing waves at either side of the calm, the form altered. One moment a collection of bones topped with undulating raven hair, the next a woman in a black corset and white skirt that bloomed and swayed around her legs. Her eyes glowed brighter as the shadow consumed the moon. The beach thickened with darkness. She waited. The eclipse is coincidence and actually hinders her deeds as she draws power from moonlight. As the first sliver of moon gradually reappeared, the surface water bulged beneath her in a sudden surge. She broke the surface of the sea without stroke or stride. The shifting continued as her dripping feet glided over the white water. At first, bare shoulders and bodice in a skirt. Then, a grim skeleton with a shock of midnight hair snaking in and out of a bony ribcage. She hovered just over the sand, then lowered. The first footprints she left behind were of bones, then flesh, as she strode forward. Her latest victim has met the proper age and was not far away. A group of revelers indulged in libation on the beach. They sat in strange collapsible chairs or stood and drank around a fire pit in the sand. They laughed a lot. It was not unlike the laughter from the marauders killers who forced her aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. She hissed at the half-realized memories and snarled at the flames that danced in her eyes and flickered upon her glistening pale bosom. She moved to give the fire and its surrounding jackals a wide berth. But one of the group spotted her. His eyes widened, then a cunning grin affixed his visage. He stumbled toward her in the dim light, bare feet kicking sand and some manner of coarse greeting spilling from his lips. Her brow arched. He is not one of the thatch. She sidestepped deeper into the darkness towards the dunes. Just before leaving the outermost bit of light, a hand encompassed her wrist. She paused in amusement as he recoiled at the cold, yet his grin quickly reappeared. His lips moved, and he gestured to the fire, spilling spirits from his cup. Her hand rose. It skimmed his vulnerable throat and moved to his whiskered cheek. His grin broadened in expectation of a cool but soft touch. Instead, a collection of frigid bones clamped onto his face and squeezed with unholy strength. Jagged fingernails dug in, drawing blood as the grip tightened. The man howled and tried to break her grip. She shook his head back and forth like a cat playing with a rat. Then her bony hand pressed behind him, forcing his head towards hers. His gaze filled with the image of a shadowy skull and glaring eyes. His lips turned cold and bloody against her teeth and bone. He screamed. She laughed and shoved him backward toward the fire. He stumbled a few steps and fell. His cohorts laughed at first, then rose to his aid when they finally noticed blood. The strange form melted into the night. 3 miles later, the same bony hands encircled the throat of her ill-fated victim. Lars Kelsen avoided local news channels. He didn't mind the pretty faces of the news bunnies or even the cookie-cutter news dudes, nor was he the type to ignore the sometimes grim realities of crime in and around Wilmington, North Carolina. Rather, it was the side effects that came with exposure to murder stories. Visitors, also known as ghosts. But instead of haunting him with bad intentions, they sought assistance. They sought justice, and from there, peace. It began as what he thought were hallucinations after Eric's murder. 20 years later, perhaps it was penance for never finding his son's killer. This time he was sweating it up on an elliptical machine after working and averting his gaze from the row of televisions. It occurred to him the problem was closer than the news broadcast, unfortunately. He had seen a couple of police cars drive behind the shopping center on his way in, but thought they were merely on patrol. Now a news van emerged, followed by 3 others. He was still trying to avoid the story when the sound drained from his earphones. Modern rock fell away to the distant background. The temperature plummeted. "Shoot," he said, slowing and then stopping with the arm and footwork. His own voice seemed hollow. He shivered despite the sweat on his face and arms. He glanced at the tattoo of his son's name in bold letters on his left forearm. Someday, Eric. The patrons of the gym were in slow motion now. Mid-pedal, mid-curl, mid-sit-up. Not Kelsen. He moved deliberately through this plane because it required vigilance, but he was not slowed like the others. He stepped off the elliptical and followed the almost magnetic pull toward the common area between the front desk and the locker rooms. The physical body wasn't there, of course, but his visitor sure as hell was. He presented in the usual 3 dimensions. A young man in a black t-shirt with the gym club name on it and athletic pants. The balls of his feet were higher than the heels and levitated a few inches from the floor. It wasn't standing per se, but the young man appeared to have been on his feet when he was murdered. The grotesque backward angle made Kelson blanch. The young man's body had been forced into a reverse U position by something far more powerful than himself. His hands gripped something unseen near his throat. The chin was higher than the glowing eyes that peered straight into Kelson's soul. "I am sorry for your unrest," he said, "but it appears you have only recently passed. Why not give the police a chance to find your justice?" The visitor was silent, of course, except for that unwavering gaze. And Kelson already knew the answer. He'd done this enough times. There was urgency involved. The next murder was imminent. The killer had a driving sense of purpose, and so did this victim's spirit. And there was something else here, something Kelson had not encountered before. Another presence moved on the periphery of this spectral dimension, one with dark intentions, one that navigated far better than some middle-aged man of flesh and blood. Kelson swallowed and stood before his visitor. He raised his arms and closed his eyes, searching. There. A shadowy figure manifested. She had long dark hair and wore a black corset and white skirt. Her skin was pale. The skirt hung like a shroud one moment, then billowed around her legs the next. She sensed him at the same time and seemed to be looking over her shoulder in surprise. A single word traveled silently from her to him. "Seer." She threw back her head and laughed. Her hand suddenly raised, fingers splayed, and a force rippled the air in his direction. He tried to duck. When he woke up, a guy with a cop badge folded over his suit pocket was on a knee looking down at him. Several gym employees were bent forward around him with worried looks on their faces. They kept asking if he was okay. "I'm fine," Kelson said, his voice gravelly. "Dehydrated, that's all. All good, folks." The detective shooed the others to step back, then spoke in low tones. "I was getting statements from coworkers and clients when the staff said somebody had gone to the floor. Came out to help and it was you. What's going on?" "Just the usual," Kelson returned, rubbing his temples. "The seeing thing? How about you take it? You're the cop after all. I'm just an old IT guy." "No way, amigo. I get enough ugly in the real world." "Details on the victim?" "Stephen Garrick, 20 years old, athletic trainer and senior at UNCW." Kelson's jaw tightened. He was just getting his start. Was it a broken neck or strangulation? Ramos's eyes narrowed. "It's too weird you know this stuff, as usual." Kelson swallowed and winced. His throat was raw, like he'd been shouting for hours. There were bruises on the visitor's neck, but I can't say for certain what the cause of death was. The medical examiner, aka your girlfriend, called just an hour ago to say it was strangulation. Happened last night out back as he was heading for his car. Strange thing is, the bruises set a pattern of what looked like finger bones, not a fleshy hand. Our victim had muscles. I figure the killer must have been big and strong to overwhelm the victim and leave bone impressions like that. Kelson mulled this over. Big? No. Strong? Yeah. "Anything from the other side on how much time until the next one?" Ramos said. "She'll be hunting again tonight," Kelson said grimly. "A female laid down those bruises?" "Not in the normal sense." "Can you be more specific, Kelson?" "You wouldn't believe me," Kelson said, starting to get up. He wobbled a little on his feet, and Ramos steadied him. You think it was easy for a pragmatist like me to believe you the first time, Ramos said. She's a ghost, Lewis. The detective stared as Kelson walked toward the locker. Just when I thought it couldn't get any weirder with you, Lars. Are you sure? Yeah. So I'm guessing the motive was not random, or drugs, or money, or any normal stuff, Ramos said. No, something deeper. Tell me about the relatives after I change, will you? Okay. Should I get silver bullets? Wouldn't hurt, but I doubt they'll work. What then? Kelson looked down. Not sure, but she killed in physical form. Maybe she can be taken out while she's that way too. He turned into the locker room. Grab a sip of my tea. Kelson needed a couple of things before trying to deal with the murdering ghost again. Information was one. A decent weapon was the other. Perhaps the first would lead to the second. Unfortunately, the repeated visits from Stephen Garrick meant time was very short. For all he knew, she was poised to strike again at this very moment. Maybe he could deter her from her goal, which also made him vulnerable. He looked at Hooper, napping in a curl with his head turned inward to rest upon his paws. He'd missed the black lab if the worst had happened. He couldn't call on his girlfriend to watch him just yet. She'd asked too many questions, and she knew about Kelson's spectral proclivities. He took Hooper for a quick walk and rapped on his neighbor's door. They had kids who loved to play with the dog in the shallow play pool out back, and the black lab had fun with their corgis. Sure, they said. They were happy to watch Hoop until tomorrow. Kelson thanked them, knelt, and patted his dog before they led him away. Hoop turned with his ears flat, and Kelson tried to reassure him with some words that came out a bit hollow. Back in his kitchen, with a view of the salt marsh from his townhouse, Kelson took a fillet knife from the drawer and washed it while thinking about the murdering ghost. The corset and skirt appeared to be centuries ago, colonial or late colonial style, but was not really a hooped skirt from the Civil War days of the mid-1800s. And then again, a casual skirt wouldn't necessarily involve hoops, so he had to amend that as well. It was risky to try and contact her again via the spectral plane. He was too much of a novice there compared to her. But he needed to try and to get some information. So this was it. He placed the knife, 2 old ragged t-shirts, and a large white polymer cutting board on the kitchen table. He took a deep breath while looking at the salt marsh, and then pulled out a chair and sat. He folded one rag, pushed it against the bottom of the cutting board, and picked up the knife. After positioning his left forearm on the board, he cut with the blade. He sucked air through his teeth as livid red sprang from the parted skin. A thin red stream ran from the cut and pooled onto the board. Kelson closed his eyes, tapped that part of his psyche prone to visits, and felt the kitchen around him drift back and forth. He dabbed his finger in the blood pool and wrote in large letters at the top of the board, "Name," then pushed mentally toward her. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the air seemed to coil around itself and pull in a specific direction, her direction. She peered at him from beneath the veil of the underworld. She was in the ocean, just beyond the waves near shore. Again, she seemed amused by his appearance. His skin went cold as she took notice. Words came to him as silent dialogue. "Thy metals summon thine own demise, little man." Kelson traced the word again in blood. "Name?" A You know not how to speak. Were I not en route, I would call upon thee. Draw the blade across thy throat, and a name ye shall have. Damn it, he was running out of time to help anyone. He tried more blood. Name? He cursed as he felt her ebb away. No sooner had it left his lips when the other rag lifted, curled tightly as if wrapped around a pointing hand, then dipped in his blood. A name was written along with a date. Molly Dossett, 1716. The knife took to the air, dangled perfectly still, then shot towards him. Kelson ducked. It flew past and lodged in the wall behind him with a thud. He stood, staring at it, wild-eyed, blood running down his arm to his fist. The knife pulled out of the wall and sliced for his throat. He sidestepped, grabbed the cutting board, and raised it as the knife came again. He heard the sharp rap and felt the jarring impact as the blade bit into the ceramic. He grabbed the handle, but it was jerked away as if he were a plaything. He flung open the back door, retreating with the cutting board as shield. Back toward the dock, the blade pushed him. With his heels on the edge, he dropped the board after impact and grabbed the knife handle with both hands. Off the dock it flung him, and with a splash he landed in 6 inches of rising tide marsh water. Kelson spun and put his 200 pounds against the handle, driving the blade into the muck beneath the sawgrass. He shoved until his wrists were buried. Finally, the blade relented. Gasping for breath, wet and bloodied and muddy, Kelson pulled himself back onto the dock. He waved to the curious neighbors and quickly hosed himself off. He showered inside, disinfecting and bandaging the cut. He Googled the name Molly Dossett in the year 1716 and went down Cyber Avenue after Cyber Avenue until finally relenting, amazed. He called Ramos, who said it was too late to save the next victim, Richard Garrick, brother of Stephen. Bullets chipped a couple of her bones, but didn't stop her, Kelson. We couldn't drive her away. We couldn't get him out of her grip, man. I'm sorry. Kelson took a breath, debated the wisdom of his next statement. The sister is next, but I'm going to try and distract our murderer first. A moment passed. Yeah? How? As with any predator. With bait. Meaning you. Meaning me. Ramos was nearby, but Kelson told him to stay behind the dunes. He had the detective and the Wrightsville Beach cop clear this section of beach between Access 7 and 9 and to keep it clear. Kelson built a good-sized bonfire in the sand, the glow reaching out to greet the red channel of the rising blood moon. He carefully unpacked the summer toy and laid it beside him. The tinfoil he'd wrapped at the tip reflecting light from the fire. It leaked an acrid odor, despite his efforts to wipe it clean. He wondered if a ghost could smell. He'd find out. The holstered sidearm pressed against his hip as he knelt. It was an improvised fit, since bullets were of no use. Kelson took a swig from the bottle of grain alcohol and grimaced as the powerful booze burned its way to his stomach. You could run a car engine on this stuff. He wondered if getting a little buzzed might actually help, then thought better of it. Kelson's research, if it could be believed, revealed Molly Dossett as the offspring of one of the hanged Paisley witches from Scotland in 1697. She probably escaped the same fate as her mother because she had been a child of 10. He had assumed she was seeking vengeance on the descendants of her mother's executioners, but that was not the case. She stayed with nuns in an orphanage until old enough to fend for herself, then joined gypsies in England, working as a fortune teller. She didn't pop up in the records for 10 years. She was listed as a passenger on a merchant ship, booking passage to the Caribbean and then to America to be a bride. Sailing toward North Carolina, her ship ran afoul of the well-known pirate Blackbeard. The transcribed account of the first mate, Israel Hands, had noted the men had tried to gain favor with and then feared the young witch woman, Molly Dosset. Blackbeard tossed her overboard with her own hands. She had sailed from England to be a bride, and instead was murdered. She had enough breath before water filled her lungs to curse the lineage of Edward Thatch, and though history did not record legitimate scion, Blackbeard had been as prone to wenching as any sailor. Now Lars Kelsen closed his eyes. All too soon the spectral plane encircled and submerged him. The flames that had licked upward now moved in slow undulation. The popping sparks seemed to float forever against the darkened skies. He turned toward the ocean and stiffened with the realization she was here already. The skeleton glowed white beneath the dark waves, then changed to the fleshy form of a young woman in a corset and writhing skirt. Her flesh was pale as her bones had been. Back and forth from body to bones, she broke the surface and floated over the sands to him. For just a moment, her glowing eyes strayed to the fire, then skewered Kelsen once more. Thy tiny flames are not dead, man. Kelsen. His hand reached for the bottle, and she suddenly halted 10 feet from him, away from the fire. She laughed. Kelsen, a fool of the highest order. There is no saving Thatch's kin tonight. You kill the innocent, Kelsen said. They have Thatch's blood, the ghost of Molly Dosset screamed. And you had witch's blood, though no greater crime than birth. The bearded bastard threw a young bride-to-be overboard. They feared you were a witch. And they were right, she laughed through bared teeth. The flesh of her body vanished. Her bare skull glowed beyond what the light from the blood moon and bonfire offered. A skull with snake-like tendrils of hair twisting and intertwining around her. Kelsen hurled the bottle. Her skeletal hand swung at the bottle with disdain, shattering it. The alcohol doused her clothes and hair. Kelsen drew the sidearm and fired. The flare whooshed forward, faster than the ghost could move. She screamed as the high-potency alcohol ignited into flaming blue. He pulled the water gun up and squeezed the trigger. A 50-50 mix of diesel and gasoline sprayed into the shrieking mass, and now the entire beach lit up with a ghostly torch. She lunged as he continued to feed the flames that attacked her, the smell of burning flesh and bone thick in the air. He evaded most of the blow and was still struck down as if he were straw. His shirt caught fire, and he let it burn as he continued to spray her with the fuel. She screamed, perhaps more in outrage than in true pain. Her flaming hand came again. This time it took his jaw over his shoulder and spun him in the sand, inadvertently snuffing his shirt and hair. She hesitated, every limb on fire, and started back toward the water. Kelsen flung the sand and grasped her flaming form from behind, arms around her waist. She clawed at his head, even as he threw her into the bonfire. The blood moon leered as the flames fed in greedy delight. The screeching, spinning form of Molly Dosset crumbled and burned and quieted into silence. Kelsen, burning and bleeding, lunged across the sand for the ocean. Then the world went black. At some point, a voice teemed with the pain to summon him from unconsciousness. Kelson, Kelson, it's Ramos. Wake up. The EMT's here for you. But what do we do with the ashes of Molly Dossett? Pain beat Kelson from all angles. Emergency lights danced over the sands and water of the Atlantic Ocean. He coughed. Through burnt, split lips, he slowly formed words. Scatter them on the tide. Let's hope she can no longer exist without her bones. Another sip of my tea. The next story is Past the Shallows by A.R. Wise. The approaching dusk had colored the sky a fiery orange that was reflected in the waters of the isolated cove. The waves came in angry, with a high, foamy surf that cascaded up the sand and rocks, lunging towards the beach with a determined swash before giving in and retreating, leaving a host of scrambling hermit crabs on a bed of shorn seaweed. Sometimes driftwood would come with the surf, adding to the collection of litter already settled here to bake in the Caribbean sun, white from salt and withered by age. Lewis felt the same, old, weathered, and a fair bit salty himself. Above him circled a single gull, cawing as if to gripe that the beach had been invaded by the old pirate. The gull only had to suffer the man for an evening, once a year, on the same date. Lewis's visit to the cove was an annual excursion, and one he wasn't sure how much longer he'd be able to make. Age addled him, but not as sourly as experience. His former life as a pirate had suffered his framed and forgotten injuries of youth had returned to plague him in his later years. His legs no longer carried him as fast and steady as they had, and it pained him to grip anything with much more strength than a toddler could manage. The thought of his gnarled hand wielding a cutlass was laughable at best. It had even become a chore to squeeze the trigger of the flintlock pistol he still carried. He regarded the pistol, holding it as if admiring an artifact. Despite keeping the metal oiled, the hammer had started to rust, and the frizzen was brittle. He'd loaded the weapon that morning and even stuffed flint in the jaws of the hammer, but it was mostly a symbolic gesture. If he dared fire the weapon, it would likely explode or fall to pieces. Lewis set the pistol aside and then started the arduous task of taking off his boots. The leather had been worn through in a few spots, and the buckles were so stiff it seemed as if they'd never been meant to open. His feet were gray and red, a mix of age and abuse, and he splayed his toes to savor the freedom. He set the boots upright, their tips facing the seam. After a brief respite, Lewis reached for the only other thing other than his gun that he'd brought. His rum was in a bottle made of amber glass, wrapped with a netting of rope held in place at the neck by a glob of red wax pressed with the seal of its maker. The cork had been chewed, and he added another set of marks as he pulled it free between his teeth. There wasn't much left. Enough for 2 good swallows, of which he'd only take 1. The liquor burned its way to his empty belly, promising to soothe his aches and pains quick enough. Lewis forced himself to stand, groaning as he did. His bare feet sank into the sand, past the hot surface to the coolness beneath. He held the bottle up in offering and yelled out, as if screaming at the sea itself, "I didn't forget you, Gray. You took the Marianne, but you didn't take me." He wavered, more from weariness than intoxication, and then headed down the dune to the edge of the strongest swash. The crabs scurried out of his way as he went in deeper, and he didn't bother hiking up his trousers before the next swash came climbing up the beach. The force of the water was enough to unsteady his stride, and it retreated with such force he felt as if the sea was trying to claim him. 13 years, Captain, and I still ain't forgotten what she said. You got the ship and all the gold, but you never got me. He corked the bottle of rum and then held the neck as he reared back to allow for the mightiest throw his aging frame could manage. The bottle spun through the air and hit the water with a hollow sploosh, sinking at first and then remerging to bob with the waves. His uncertain footing was challenged by a riptide, and he fell to one knee, spun, and was momentarily submerged before the wave receded and gave him the chance to breathe again. The taste of brine filled his mouth, and he wiped away the seawater from his gray goatee before laughing. He got to his feet and made his way up the beach again, safe from the darkening water that thirsted for his soul. "Good try," he said between restless laughs, "but you still didn't get me." He made a rude gesture at the sea, just like he'd seen his captain do 100 times before. Salt stung his eyes and tears clouded his vision. When he turned to look back at the spot where he'd been sitting earlier, he thought he saw a man. He wiped away the sea from the crags in his weathered cheeks, squinted, and saw that it hadn't been an illusion. There was someone standing there, holding his flintlock pistol. "Hey, you there," said Lewis, with a vicious, intimidating tone gleaned from years of practice. "Put that down." "Is it yours?" asked the stranger, with a child's voice. Lewis wiped his face again, hoping to ease the murkiness his old eyes afforded. He marched up the beach, his feet sinking deep into the sand as he went. As he neared, he saw that it was no man invading the secluded spot, but a boy. It had been a long time since Lewis had commiserated with a child, but he guessed this one to be no older than 12 or 13, with sun-kissed skin and blonde hair. "Put it down if you know what's good for you." The boy dropped the weapon with little regard to its well-being and stood his ground unflinching. Lewis knew how to deal with a cocksure whelp like this. He stormed up to him, placed his hand to the boy's chest, and shoved him back. The child staggered and then fell, but didn't show any sign of fear as the old stranger loomed above him. "What you doing coming down here and taking things that don't belong to you? Planning for an early grave, are ya? Send your ma and pa weeping their way to the cemetery if you keep acting like this." "My parents are dead." The child stayed on his butt, staring up at Lewis as if he had nothing to fear and less to lose. "An orphan, then. Even better," said Lewis as he picked up his pistol, dusted off the sand, and then plunged the barrel into its holster at his side. "No one to come looking for revenge after I slit you ear to ear." "Are you a pirate?" Lewis glared at the boy in silence for a moment and then let out a sharp laugh. "That's the question of a boy who's thirsting for a peek at the hereafter. What's got you asking something like that?" "People around here say this is where a pirate used to anchor." "That what they say?" asked Lewis with a curious glance in the direction of the only town around. far through the thick jungle that choked the interior of the island. The boy nodded. And you came here for what? To see a real live pirate? You know what they say about curiosity, boy. They say it ain't no good for your health, and I might be agreeing with them. I just wanted to know if it was true. And then, emboldened by foolish courage, the boy followed by asking, "Is it?" Louis was confounded into momentary silence by the boy's eagerness to know something he had no business learning. There was something about the child's courage that endeared him to Louis, and the old pirate snickered before saying, "Yup, it's true." "And you're really a pirate?" "Was, a lifetime ago. But my ship sank, taking my crew and my gold with it." "Were you part of Captain Gray's crew?" the boy asked with reverence. "How you know that name?" "Everyone here knows it. Captain Gray and his ship, the Marianne. They're a legend around here." "Ain't no legend, kid. Ain't a legend when it's true." "And were you really?" The boy showed his first sign of fear, with wide eyes staring up at the old pirate. "Were you really part of his crew?" I've always wondered what it was like to be a pirate, back before the Royal Navy started their patrols, back when things were good. "Good?" asked Louis before letting out a hearty guffaw. "Good? Things weren't never good, boy. Don't go fooling yourself more than you already had. It was never good." The boy looked crestfallen by the rebuke and muttered, "It sounded good to me." "Did it? And what sounded good about it to you?" "The life, the danger, the money, and going port to port, living free. I know it was dangerous, but Captain Gray made it out all right. They say he's living back in Spain, fat and happy and rich." "That what they say?" The boy nodded. "Then they're fools. Captain Gray's not in Spain, he ain't rich, and he sure as hell ain't happy." "Then where is he?" Louis regarded the boy suspiciously, as if sizing him up. The rum burned in the pirate's belly and allowed for a willingness to tell the truth that Louis might not have had otherwise. "You want to know the whole truth, lad? All right, I'll tell you." He pointed to the cove where the setting sun had given up on brightening the dark, calamitous water that churned there. The shadows of the nearby landscape shadowed the scene. "That's old Captain Gray's grave. Right there, 'neath them waves, past the shallows. That's where we left him, chained up with the rest of his loyals, chained up and pushed off, left to drown there." The boy just stared, wide-eyed and eager to listen. "That's right, kid. Your fabled pirate captain ain't nothing but bone by now. Him and the crew that wouldn't join my mutiny are down there somewhere. And you know why I did it? You want to know why? Because he came here to kick up his boots and quit the life we built together. I spent 20-some years with that man out there fighting and killing, stealing and whatnot. You see, kid, I wasn't just some buccaneer who joined up to see what the pirate's life was like. No, I was Gray's first mate, Louis the Liar they used to call me. Well, old Louis the Liar earned his name when he promised his captain he'd help with one last haul. Gray wanted to come here 'cause some witchy woman snatched his heart, had him tied around her finger like she cast a spell on him. He wanted to gather up his gold and make a life with her here. He was going to give me a ship. I was going to take his crew and the Marianne back to sea to live the only life I ever knew. Only, what sort of pirate would let that happen? No sort of pirate who's worth a damn, that's for sure. Lewis regarded the sea, bitter and hateful. The lonely gulls circled, cawing as the two strangers met below. Then it really is you. You're really Lewis the liar, said the boy. But he left a part out of the story. Lewis looked down at him, intrigued. You hunted down and killed the woman Gray loved, and before you killed her, she put a curse on you. She said that you and the Marianne would both sink to the bottom of the ocean. How'd you know that? Asked Lewis, spooked by the boy's knowledge. But I know something you don't. The woman Gray loved was pregnant when you killed her. And you're right, she was witchy. The child had a hateful smirk. Who are you? Asked Lewis as he drew his pistol. Aldous Gray, the unborn son of Captain William Gray and Rebecca White, and I've come for what's mine. Lewis pointed the pistol at the boy and pulled the trigger, but the hammer broke, the brittle frizzen when it was struck, and the spark the flint inspired was barely enough to cause a flash and a puff of smoke. The boy was undaunted by the threat and advanced. Stay back, said Lewis as he staggered away. I've come for my father's revenge. Lewis heard the rattle of chains and turned to see the dead rising from the dark water of the cove, chained by the wrists to one another and dragging an anchor behind them, just like they'd been the day Lewis ordered they be pushed from the side of the Marianne to drown. Suddenly the boy was upon him, icing fingers gripping his throat. The child was imbued with otherworldly strength that brought Lewis to his knees. Aldous Gray's eyes faded to white, and the rest of his form followed suit, revealing the ghostly apparition for what it truly was. Let the sea claim its prize, said the boy, his voice echoing as if screamed from a mountaintop. Chains wrapped around Lewis's throat, and he was dragged back, kicking and screaming through the sand. The foamy swash flooded over him, and he choked as the salt water filled his throat. The dead dragged their fellow pirate back to the sea, past the shallows, to the grave that had always been open for him. The following morning, a pair of boots stood alone in the sand, as if a ghost stood staring out at the cove, as an empty rum bottle came in to settle on the litter-strewn beach, and above, a lonely gull cawed. enjoyed the gameplay of Darkest Dungeon and the spooky pirate ghost stories. And as always, I hope to see you all again very